Inspector Cranton's face flushed with the particular shade of crimson that suggests wounded pride colliding with professional incompetence. He opened his mouth, closed it again with the audible click of teeth, and appeared to be considering whether Whimsy's question constituted a deliberate insult or merely the ramblings of an eccentric. Parker, who had witnessed this sort of exchange countless times, intervened with the smoothness of long practice. The housekeeper noted it was still warm enough that she initially wondered if the Reverend had only just stepped away, Parker explained, consulting his notebook with the precision of a man who understood that details, however minute, often possessed the remarkable capacity to separate the guilty from the merely unfortunate. She touched the cup, withdrew her hand rather quickly, and it was at that precise moment she observed the body. The window was closed, the door locked from the inside, and the key was discovered in the Reverend's pocket. Whimsy, who had been examining the graveyard with an intensity that suggested the corpses therein possessed more immediate interest than the living, finally withdrew from his position and moved toward the sideboard with the casual grace of a man accustomed to finding refreshment wherever he traveled. "Locked room murder," he observed, extracting a decanter and examining its contents with the air of a customs inspector appraising contraband. How startlingly theatrical. One almost expects to find a masked figure and a cryptic message written in blood upon the, what is it called, Inspector? A parchment? A tablet? Or have we progressed to something more modern, like a typed note upon foolscap? Cranton, uncertain whether this constituted sarcasm or genuine inquiry, opted for the safest possible response. A non-committal grunt, followed by an elaborate study of his boot heels. Miss Pritchard, the housekeeper, entered at that moment carrying a tray laden with the sort of light refreshments that English village women seem to believe constitute adequate compensation for discussing matters of sudden death. She was a woman of approximately 50 years, with the sort of face that suggested she had witnessed a great many things without permitting any of them to disturb her fundamental worldview. Her grey hair was pinned with military precision. Her dress was black, whether from mourning or from a preference for practical attire remained unclear, and her hands possessed that particular steadiness that comes from decades spent managing both household and household crises with equal aplomb. Whimsy, setting down his glass with evident approval, turned his attention toward her with a sort of focused interest that made people feel simultaneously flattered and vaguely incriminated. "Miss Pritchard," he began, deploying his most charming smile, "I wonder if you might illuminate several matters that appear to have escaped the notice of my official colleagues. First, at what precise hour did you last see the Reverend Canon alive, and what was his demeanor at that moment?" Miss Pritchard settled into the chair, offered her with the care of one accustomed to sitting in drawing-rooms only when disaster demanded it. "9:15 last evening, sir. I brought his supper, cold meat and bread, as was his custom on Tuesday evenings, into his study where he was already seated at his desk, going through his correspondence as he always did after dinner. He seemed quite as usual, sir, perhaps a touch distracted, but then he often was when dealing with the church business." Whimsy leaned forward with the posture of a confessor receiving a particularly juicy sin. "And his tea this morning? Who prepared it and when?" "I prepared it at 6:30, sir, as I do. Every morning. A single cup, strong, with milk and 1 sugar. I left it on the tray outside his study door. That was our arrangement, you see. He liked his breakfast tea at 7:15, and I always left it outside his door so he could fetch it himself without my disturbing his work." Parker was now watching Whimsy with the expression of a man who had seen this particular performance countless times and was nonetheless curious to observe what rabbit might be extracted from what hat. "And the door to his study?" Whimsy continued, his tone suggesting this was a matter of the most profound triviality. "Was it locked when you left the tea?" "Locked, sir, as always. The Reverend was quite particular about his privacy during the morning hours. It was his study, you understand. The rest of us were not to disturb him until he rang the bell for his 11s at 10 o'clock. Whimsy sat back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of profound contemplation that had caused more than one suspect to confess to crimes they hadn't actually committed, simply from the anxiety of wondering what he was thinking. "Most fascinating," he murmured. "And the window?" "Locked from the inside, sir. always locked. The Reverend was concerned about drafts, you see. The study windows were fitted with those modern weather seals, quite expensive, and he was most careful to ensure they remained properly closed. Inspector Cranton, who had been growing increasingly restless during this exchange, finally ventured an observation. The poison must have been in the tea then. The housekeeper prepared it herself, so unless she poisoned it, which seems unlikely given she's worked for the Reverend for 23 years without incident, someone must have tampered with it between her preparing it and his consuming it. We've questioned the servants, the cook, the gardener, even the boy W. Ho delivers milk. No one reports seeing anyone near the study that morning. Whimsy's lips curved into that particular smile that suggested amusement mixed with pity for those not blessed with his particular faculties. How very logical, he observed, and how very wrong. Tell me, Inspector, when precisely was the tea consumed? Did the Reverend fetch it at 7:15, or might there be some small possibility that he did not? The question hung in the air like smoke from a particularly stubborn cigar, and it was Miss Pritchard who broke the silence with the sort of hesitant clarity that suggests a memory only just surfacing from the depths of habit and routine. "Well, sir," she began, her fingers plucking at the fabric of her skirt in a manner that betrayed some interior agitation, "I cannot say with absolute certainty that he fetched it at 7:15, can I? I left it there at that time, yes, but I did not observe him taking it. I was downstairs attending to the kitchen. The Reverend was quite particular about his morning routine being undisturbed." Whimsy rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man who had just received confirmation of something he had suspected all along, and began to pace the drawing room with his hands clasped behind his back, a gesture that Parker recognized as portending either a brilliant deduction or an exceedingly tedious digression into medieval Latin. "Most illuminating," Whimsy remarked, his tone suggesting he was speaking more to himself than to his assembled audience. "Inspector Cranton, I perceive that your investigation has proceeded upon the assumption that the Reverend expired at approximately 7:30 this morning, based upon the housekeeper's discovery and the relative warmth of the teacup. But what if, and I pose this merely as a theoretical exercise, what if the Reverend had not yet consumed his breakfast tea? At all? What if he had, in fact, consumed it the previous evening, or the evening before that, or indeed at some point sufficiently remote that the question of when it was drunk becomes rather less relevant than why it was poisoned at all?" Inspector Cranton's expression suggested he was being presented with an elaborate mathematical proof conducted entirely in Sanskrit. Parker, however, leaned forward with the intensity of a man who had just observed the first glimmer of genuine investigation. "You're suggesting the poison was administered earlier?" he inquired, his notebook already being retrieved from his pocket. "Not necessarily earlier," Whimsy corrected, continuing his pacing with the methodical precision of a man walking the perimeter of a particularly troublesome problem. "I am suggesting that the warmth of the teacup, which your investigative colleagues appear to have elevated to the status of irrefutable fact, may be the result of a number of circumstances entirely unrelated to the actual time of death. A teacup retains heat in a manner dependent upon room temperature, the particular thickness of the porcelain, the initial temperature of the liquid, and indeed the rather mundane question of whether someone has recently warmed the pot or stood it near a heat source. Furthermore, and this is where matters become rather more intriguing, if the Reverend did not fetch his tea at the appointed hour, what was he doing instead?" Miss Pritchard, who had been listening to this discourse with the rapt attention of a woman discovering that her understanding of her employer's routine was considerably less comprehensive than she had believed, ventured a trembling observation. "He might have. That is, on some mornings he did not always fetch the tea precisely at 7:15. Sometimes he was quite absorbed in his work and would not remember until much later. I would end him sometimes, if the cup had grown cold." Whimsy stopped his pacing and directed toward her a look of such concentrated interest that she appeared to shrink slightly into a chair. "And on Tuesday morning, Miss Pritchard, did you find it necessary to remind him?" "No, sir. I assumed he had fetched it, you see. The cup was gone when I came upstairs to tidy the study at 8:30, or at least, I thought it was gone." Her voice had diminished to barely above a whisper, and her hands had ceased their plucking at her skirt and instead lay folded in her lap with the rigidity of a supplicant at confession. Parker's eyes narrowed with that particular focus that detectives develop when they sense they are approaching something substantive. "What do you mean? You thought it was gone?" Whimsy resumed his seat with the air of a man settling in for a particularly absorbing narrative, his fingers once more steepled beneath his chin. "I believe Miss Pritchard is attempting to tell us that she did not, in fact, enter the study at 8:30, as is her habit. Is that not so? And the reason she did not do so was what precisely?" Miss Pritchard's face had assumed the pallor of someone who has just realized that a minor omission in one's testimony has acquired considerably more significance than previously appreciated. "The Reverend had left word, sir, by way of a note, that I was not to disturb him on Tuesday morning. He had received a visitor on Monday evening, you see, quite late, and he seemed rather concerned about something. He said he had matters to attend to that could not be delayed, and that I should not trouble myself with his study until he rang for me. I thought nothing of it at the time, sir. The Reverend often had visitors from the parish, people with troubles needing his counsel. Inspector Cranton, who had been regarding this exchange with the bewilderment of a man watching a conjurer produce increasingly improbable objects from an otherwise empty hat, finally ventured an observation. But the body was found at 7:30, Miss Pritchard. You discovered it yourself when you went to lay out his breakfast." Miss Pritchard shook her head with the slow certainty of someone correcting a fundamental misunderstanding. "No, sir. I found the body at 8:30. That was when I realized something was dreadfully wrong and went to fetch Constable Burton. But the body was already quite cold, sir. Already quite stiff. I thought at first he had simply collapsed at his desk, perhaps in the night, but even then I could see that he must have been dead for some considerable time." Whimsy rose once more, and his expression had shifted from amusement to something rather more complex, a sort of grim satisfaction mixed with the particular sorrow that accompanies the discovery of human duplicity. "Then the question becomes," he observed quietly, "not when the Reverend consumed his poisoned tea, but rather whether the person we are currently discussing actually entered that study at all on Tuesday morning." The silence that followed Whimsy's observation was of that particular quality that suggests the collective consciousness of a room has just been fundamentally rearranged. Parker set down his pen with deliberate care, while Inspector Cranton appeared to be conducting some form of internal arithmetic that was proving considerably more complex than his intellectual faculties could comfortably accommodate. Miss Pritchard had gone quite white, and her hands had resumed their earlier plucking motion with increased urgency. Whimsy, observing these reactions with the benign satisfaction of a man who had just orchestrated a minor psychological earthquake, moved toward the study door with the purposefulness of someone embarking UPO. A familiar task. "If I may impose upon your hospitality," he remarked to no one in particular, "I should rather like to examine the study in its current state, undisturbed by the well-meaning ministrations of your local constabulary. Inspector, I trust the room remains precisely as it was discovered." Cranton bristled slightly at the implication that his men might have disturbed evidence, but Parker forestalled any defensive response by rising and moving toward the study door himself. "We've been quite careful," Parker assured Whimsy, producing a key from his waistcoat pocket. "The room was locked after the body was removed, and no one has entered since the preliminary examination. The body itself has been taken to the mortuary in town for proper post-mortem, but everything else remains as it was. The study, when they entered, bore that particular atmosphere of spaces recently vacated by death, a sort of atmospheric staleness that seemed to linger despite the room's evident tidiness. The desk, a substantial mahogany affair positioned before the windows overlooking the graveyard, held scattered papers, a fountain pen resting in a small brass tray, and the conspicuous absence of a teacup. The chair behind the desk bore faint stains of what Parker's preliminary examination had suggested was indeed vomit, a detail that seemed to have escaped Inspector Cranton's detailed notes. Whimsy approached the desk with the reverence of an archaeologist examining an ancient tomb, and proceeded to examine it with a thoroughness that suggested he was reading rather more from its surface than the mere arrangement of objects. He lifted papers with studied care, noted the position of the pen, observed the precise angle at which the chair had been positioned, and conducted this examination entirely in silence, his expression shifting through states of consideration that Parker had learned. to interpret as ranging from minor interest to profound significance. Finally, he turned his attention to the windows themselves, testing each pane and examining the locks with the care of a man who suspected them of harboring secrets. "The windows," he announced, "have not been opened in some considerable time. There is dust upon the sills indicating that no one has disturbed them, and the locks themselves possess that unmistakable patina of months undisturbed. Not, I venture to suggest, the windows of a room in which a murder has recently occurred, but rather the windows of a room that has been sealed as though by some ancient curse." Inspector Cranton opened his mouth to protest, but Whimsy raised a hand with the casual authority of a man accustomed to imposing silence through sheer force of personality. He moved instead to the door itself, examining the lock mechanism with meticulous attention. "This, however," he continued, his voice taking on that particular tone that suggested revelation was imminent, "is rather more interesting. The lock is of modern manufacture, fitted within the last decade or so, and it possesses the curious characteristic of being capable of being operated from either side. That is to say, one might lock oneself within the room or unlock oneself from without, provided one possessed the requisite key." Parker leaned closer, his detective's mind already beginning to restructure the implications of Whimsy's observation. "You're suggesting the door was locked after the Reverend's death, not before?" Whimsy smiled, that particular smile that suggested amusement mixed with a certain pedagogical satisfaction. "I am suggesting," he corrected gently, "that the locked room upon which your investigation has presumably rested as a cornerstone of security is perhaps rather less secure than one might initially believe. Consider, if you will, that the Reverend received a visitor on Monday evening, a visitor of sufficient concern that he felt compelled to leave instructions that he was not to be disturbed on Tuesday morning. Consider further that this visitor departed at some hour subsequent to dinner, but prior to the Reverend retiring. And consider finally that the Reverend, having admitted this visitor to his study, would have possessed no reason whatsoever to lock the door immediately thereafter, particularly if the visitor was someone he knew and trusted." Inspector Cranton appeared to be struggling with the implications of this line of reasoning. "You're suggesting someone came back and locked the room after the murder?" Whimsy turned from his examination of the door and regarded Cranton with an expression that mingled sympathy with intellectual exasperation. "I am suggesting, Inspector, that someone possessed the key to this study and was therefore capable of entering and exiting without requiring the door to be broken, the window to be forced, or any other dramatic circumstance that your investigation has apparently been assuming occurred. The locked room, you see, is not proof of innocence. It is merely evidence of prior access." Parker moved to the desk and began examining the scattered papers with renewed attention. "What about the correspondence? Were there any letters from the visitor, or any indication of what the concern might have been?" Whimsy settled himself into the leather chair behind the desk, the same chair in which Canon Hargreaves had presumably expired, and examined the papers with the air of a man reading a particularly illuminating manuscript. "These," he observed, holding several sheets aloft, "are parish accounts, and rather poorly managed ones at that. Church funds appear to have been in a state of rather more disorder than one might expect from an ordained gentleman of the Church of England. There are notations here suggesting certain monies had been misappropriated, though the handwriting suggests the good canon was attempting to obscure rather than clarify these transactions. But here, he produced a single sheet from beneath a blotter. We have something considerably more interesting. A letter, addressed to the Reverend, written in a hand both trembling and furious, expressing sentiments of such bitter reproach that one wonders how the poor canon managed to survive even until Monday evening. Parker accepted the letter and began reading, his expression darkening as he progressed through its accusations and revelations. Miss Pritchard, who had followed them into the study despite no explicit invitation, drew a sharp breath. "That's Mr. Hargreaves' writing," she whispered. "The Reverend's nephew. He's been away for near on 2 years, working abroad, but he returned to the village just this past Monday afternoon." Whimsy's expression underwent that subtle transformation that Parker recognized as preceding a particularly astute observation, though whether it constituted satisfaction or disappointment remained, as ever, impenetrably obscured beneath layers of aristocratic inscrutability. He rose from the desk chair with deliberate slowness, as though the weight of this revelation required physical adjustment, and moved toward the fireplace where a series of framed photographs presented themselves as silent witnesses to the canon's domestic history. The nephew, he mused, extracting one particular photograph and examining it with interest, returning after 2 years' absence, and coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, arriving precisely the day before his uncle's untimely demise. How remarkably theatrical. Tell me, Miss Pritchard, what was the nature of Mr. Hargreaves' absence? Employment, misadventure, or perhaps something rather more complicated? Miss Pritchard seemed to gather courage from the simple act of being directly addressed. He went to Africa, sir, to work for a mining concern. The Reverend's brother, that's Mr. Hargreaves Sr., had arranged it all. Young Mr. Hargreaves was going to make his fortune, or so the family believed. But then, about 6 months ago, the letters stopped coming entirely. We heard nothing from him until yesterday, when he simply appeared at the vicarage door looking, begging your pardon, sir, like something the cat had dragged in. Inspector Cranton, who appeared to be experiencing a dawning realization that his investigation had been proceeding along fundamentally erroneous lines, finally ventured a question. Where is the nephew now? Have we questioned him? Whimsy set down the photograph with care and turned to regard Cranton with an expression of mild interest. An excellent question, Inspector, and one which raises several others of considerably more significance. Specifically, where indeed is Mr. Hargreaves, and what has he been doing since his arrival yesterday? Has he been residing at the vicarage, or has he taken rooms elsewhere? Has anyone actually observed him since the discovery of his uncle's body? Parker was already consulting his notebook, his expression suggesting that several gaps in the investigative record were becoming distressingly apparent. We've had men trying to locate him since this morning, he admitted. The local constable reported that he'd been staying at the public house, the Crown, I believe, but when we sent someone to fetch him this morning, we discovered his room appeared to have been vacated sometime during the night. His belongings were still there, but he himself had vanished. Whimsy moved to the window and gazed out toward the graveyard with that particular intensity that suggested he was contemplating matters of profound philosophical weight. How very convenient, he observed. A bereaved nephew, recently returned from abroad, conveniently absent at the precise moment his uncle is discovered to be deceased. One almost wonders whether the universe itself is conspiring to confirm his guilt, or whether someone rather more cunning has gone to considerable effort to arrange matters in precisely such a manner. He turned back from the window, and his expression had shifted into that state of focused intensity that preceded his most significant revelations. Inspector, I perceive that your investigation has proceeded upon certain unexamined assumptions. First, that the teacup found warm upon the desk necessarily indicates the time of death occurred within a narrow window of the morning hours. Second, that the locked room constitutes evidence of a sealed death chamber requiring miraculous ingress or egress. Third, that a bereaved nephew conveniently absent at a convenient moment necessarily constitutes the guilty party. All three assumptions are, I would venture, substantially incorrect. He moved toward the desk and, producing a pencil from his jacket pocket, lifted the fountain pen from its brass tray with exaggerated care. This pen, he continued, has been used recently, within the past day or so, to write a considerable volume of correspondence. Yet the inkwell beside it is nearly dry, and the blotter beneath these papers contains impressions suggesting several pages of correspondence written in considerable haste and agitation. Now the question becomes, who wrote these letters? Parker moved to examine the blotter more closely, tilting it toward the light. There are impressions here, he acknowledged, but they're largely illegible. However, I can see fragments. My entire life. Unforgivable betrayal. Cannot forgive. He paused, his detective's mind apparently making connections. This isn't the nephew. W's hand, is it? This is older, the script less modern. Whimsy settled back into the leather chair with the satisfaction of a man observing a particularly talented student finally grasping an elementary principle. Precisely so. These are the Reverend's own letters, written in response to his nephew's accusations. And if we are to believe Miss Pritchard's testimony regarding the note instructing her not to enter the study, then the Reverend was engaged in some form of correspondence of sufficient urgency to warrant his complete isolation on the morning of his death. Inspector Cranton appeared to be struggling with the implications. But if the Reverend was alive and writing letters on Tuesday morning, then surely he was poisoned after 7 o'clock, when he supposedly fetched his tea. Whimsy rose once more and moved toward the door with the air of a man who had extracted sufficient information from the current location and was preparing to move his investigation to more productive ground. The Reverend, I would suggest, was poisoned considerably earlier than 7 o'clock, Inspector. He was poisoned Monday evening, when his visitor, his nephew presumably, presented himself at this study door. The letter we discovered, the one written in the nephew's hand, was not delivered in person but rather left for the Reverend to discover upon his return from dinner. The Reverend then spent the remainder of Monday evening and all of Tuesday morning engaged in a desperate attempt to respond to accusations of such magnitude that they drove him to frantic correspondence. He paused at the threshold, his hand resting upon the doorframe. And the poisoned tea? That was not consumed on Tuesday morning at all. That was consumed Monday evening, shortly after the nephew's arrival, when the Reverend, distressed beyond measure by what he had read, forgot entirely about Miss Pritchard's CA. Refill preparations, and instead partook of refreshment administered by his own guest. By the time Tuesday morning arrived, the Reverend had been dead for approximately 12 hours, and the room had been locked by someone who wished the death to appear to have occurred at a time considerably more convenient to their own purposes. Parker's expression had shifted into that particular configuration that Whimsy recognized as the moment when a trained investigator realizes the entire architecture of his case has been standing upon foundations of sand. He closed his notebook with deliberate finality and turned toward Inspector Cranton with the air of a man preparing to deliver unwelcome truths to his professional inferior. The nephew, Parker said quietly, would have had access to the house Monday evening. Miss Pritchard confirmed he arrived Monday afternoon. If he visited the study that evening, then he would have encountered his uncle in a state of considerable emotional disturbance. Whimsy interrupted, moving down the corridor toward the front parlor with the purposefulness of someone embarking upon a predetermined course of action. A state, I would suggest, deliberately engineered by the presentation of accusations regarding matters sufficiently grave to warrant the Reverend's complete psychological destabilization. The question is not whether the nephew administered the poison, but rather whether he did so with premeditation or whether the poisoning was, in fact, an altogether different proposition from the one we have been assuming. They descended the narrow staircase that led to the vicarage's ground floor, where the late afternoon light was beginning to acquire that particular golden quality that presaged the early winter dusk. Miss Pritchard followed at a respectful distance, her earlier agitation having given way to something more akin to resignation. Wimps. I paused at the bottom of the stairs and turned to address her directly. Miss Pritchard, I require certain information regarding the household's domestic arrangements. Specifically, who prepares the Reverend's evening refreshments, and what was his custom regarding the consumption of beverages before retiring? The housekeeper appeared to be struggling with the implications of the question. Mrs. Cottrell, the cook, sir. She was with us for 15 years, very reliable, but she left quite suddenly about 3 months ago. Said she was going to live with her daughter in Hampshire. After she left, I took over most of the kitchen duties, though the Reverend was perfectly content with simpler arrangements than Mrs. Cottrell had provided. Whimsy's eyes narrowed with that particular focus that suggested a crucial detail was being approached from an unexpected angle. And the Reverend's evening beverage, what was his custom? He would take a cup of cocoa or warm milk before retiring, sir, usually at about 9 o'clock. He was quite regular in his habits. Monday evening he asked for cocoa, which was unusual. He generally preferred milk, but I thought nothing of it at the time. Inspector Cranton appeared to be experiencing a moment of dawning comprehension. "You prepared the cocoa?" "Yes, sir, and I left it on the side table in his study with his book and his reading glasses. He was sitting at his desk when I brought it in. He'd sent for it when the nephew arrived, asking if I would prepare something warm. I thought perhaps they were getting along, you see, though the Reverend seemed rather tense." Parker was now consulting his preliminary notes from the scene examination, his expression growing darker as he read. The post-mortem report indicated cyanide poisoning, but it didn't specify the precise vector of administration. We assumed it was the tea found in the study because... He paused, realization seeming to crystallize. "Because we found a teacup, and we assumed the teacup must have contained the poison. But the post-mortem specifically noted that the Reverend's stomach contents suggested he had consumed a warm beverage, but the analysis was inconclusive regarding whether it was tea or cocoa." Whimsy settled himself into an armchair in the front parlor with the air of a man who had assembled sufficient pieces of an exceedingly complex puzzle to perceive the outline of the complete design. "The cocoa, Miss Pritchard." "Who requested that it be prepared? Did the Reverend himself make this request, or was it suggested to him?" Miss Pritchard's face had gone quite pale. "The nephew, sir, Mr. Hargreaves, Jr. When he arrived, he went straight to find his uncle. I heard raised voices from the study, though I couldn't make out the words. After perhaps half an hour, the Reverend rang for me and asked if I would prepare cocoa. He said they were going to discuss family matters and he would need sustenance. I thought it was a gesture of reconciliation, sir. I genuinely did." Whimsy rose from his chair and began pacing the parlor in that characteristic manner that suggested his mental processes were occurring at considerable velocity. "Inspector Cranton," he said, his tone taking on that particular quality that preceded his most definitive pronouncements, "I perceive that your investigation has identified the guilty party with remarkable accuracy, though for substantially incorrect reasons. The nephew has indeed fled the village, and his flight is entirely consistent with the guilt of murder. However, the murder was not premeditated, nor was it executed with the cold calculation that one might initially suppose. Rather, it was a crime of passion, performed in a moment of extreme emotional disturbance, with the poison administered not by the nephew himself, but by an agent entirely separate from the events of Monday evening." Parker leaned forward with the intensity of a man whose entire investigative framework was being simultaneously dismantled and reconstructed. "What agent? The cook who left 3 months ago?" "Precisely," Whimsy confirmed. "Mrs. Cottrell, who departed quite suddenly after 15 years of faithful service." "Tell me, Inspector, have you made any inquiries regarding the reason for her departure? Did anyone question her regarding the circumstances of her resignation?" Cranton appeared genuinely bewildered. "She simply left, sir. Gave notice one day and was gone the next. Miss Pritchard said she didn't seem to have any particular grievance." Whimsy returned to his chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin, in that attitude profound contemplation that suggested the final pieces of the puzzle were aligning themselves with satisfying precision. "Then, I suspect, when your investigation proceeds to its proper conclusion, you will discover that Mrs. Cottrell has been residing in Hampshire under a false name, and that she has been in regular correspondence with a certain individual currently absconded from the village of Ashford-Abbas. Furthermore, I venture to suggest that Mrs. Cottrell possessed both knowledge of the Reverend's household arrangements and a motive of such profound nature that she was willing to administer poison to a man she had served loyally for 15 years. The question now becomes, what was that motive? The revelation hung suspended in the parlor air like incense smoke, and it was Parker who finally broke the weighted silence with the measured tones of a man accustomed to pursuing truth through its most tortuous passages. "Mrs. Cottrell's motive," he said slowly, "would have to be substantial enough to overcome 15 years of loyalty and the considerable moral impediment of administering poison to an employer. What could possibly justify such a betrayal?" Whimsy rose and moved toward the window, where the graveyard beyond had begun to assume that particular quality of melancholy peculiar to English churchyards at the onset of winter twilight. "Consider, if you will," he commenced, his tone taking on that professorial quality that suggested he was about to illuminate something that should have been apparent all along, the nature of household service in England. A cook of Mrs. Cottrell's evident competence and loyalty would have been entrusted with far more than the mere preparation of meals. She would have become, almost by necessity, a confidant of sorts, privy to domestic arrangements, family secrets, the sorts of intimate details that servants inevitably accumulate through proximity and discretion. Now, the Reverend Canon Hargreaves was a man of considerable standing in the parish, yet his nephew felt compelled to write a letter of such bitter accusation that it drove the canon to frantic correspondence. What betrayal could warrant such venom? Inspector Cranton appeared to be marshalling his intellectual resources toward understanding this particular line of reasoning. You're suggesting the Reverend had done something to the nephew, something regarding his employment abroad, perhaps, or his inheritance? Not merely something done to the nephew, Whimsy corrected, but something done to someone the nephew held considerably more dear. Consider the timeline with precision. The nephew was sent abroad 2 years ago to work for a mining concern. Employment arranged, Miss Pritchard informed us, by the Reverend's brother, the nephew's father. Employment that was meant to make the boy's fortune. Yet 6 months ago, the letters ceased entirely. The nephew simply disappeared from contact with his family for a period of 18 months, only to reappear yesterday looking, in Miss Pritchard's admittedly colourful phrase, like something the cat had dragged in. He paused, allowing this chronology to settle into the consciousness of his listeners. Now, what occurs in Africa that would cause a young man to cease all correspondence with his family? What happens in Africa that would render him unable or unwilling to write home? Parker's expression suggested that certain possibilities were beginning to present themselves. Illness, he ventured, an accident. Imprisonment, perhaps, or some form of scandal. Precisely, Whimsy interrupted, and in particular one form of illness that was, during the period in question, rendering Africa decidedly inhospitable to European miners. A form of illness that would have rendered the young man incapable of writing, of working, of conducting any form of correspondence whatsoever for an extended period. A form of illness that would have required nursing care, and quite substantial nursing care at that. Miss Pritchard had drawn a sharp breath, her hand moving to her mouth in a gesture of dawning horror. Mr. Hargreaves Jr. was ill, gravely ill. But no one said, "The Reverend never." The Reverend said nothing, Whimsy agreed, because he apparently decided that silence was preferable to explanation. Perhaps he was ashamed of his nephew's condition. Perhaps he feared scandal. Or perhaps, and this is where Mrs. Cottrell becomes relevant to our narrative, perhaps the Reverend was actively engaged in concealing information rather than merely omitting it. Parker had begun to make rapid notes, his investigative instincts now operating at full capacity. You believe the Reverend deliberately withheld information about his nephew's illness from the family? I believe, Whimsy said, settling himself once more into the leather chair with the air of a man about to deliver testimony of considerable weight, that Mrs. Cottrell possessed a personal connection to the nephew, a connection sufficiently profound that the Reverend's apparent indifference regarding the boy's fate drove her to extraordinary measures. A daughter, perhaps, a granddaughter, possibly even, and this is where the psychology becomes particularly complex, a romantic attachment of a nature that the Reverend deemed inappropriate or scandalous. Inspector Cranton appeared utterly bewildered. But how could we possibly determine? The mining company records, Whimsy interrupted smoothly, would indicate precisely which individuals were employed in the relevant location during the relevant period. The hospital records from whatever settlement serviced the mining operations would indicate admissions and nursing care. Mrs. Cottrell's correspondence, should you examine it with proper legal authority, would almost certainly contain letters regarding a young man's illness and recovery, correspondence that was kept secret from the Reverend precisely because she understood that he had made a deliberate choice to obscure the truth from his family. He paused, allowing the implications to crystallize. The nephew returned to Ashford Abbas yesterday because he had recovered sufficiently to travel. He came to confront his uncle regarding the years of silence, the years during which he was gravely ill and apparently abandoned by his family. The letter we discovered, the one written in his trembling, furious hand, was his accusation regarding his uncle's betrayal, and the Reverend, upon reading those accusations, understood for the first time the full extent of what his silence had accomplished. Parker set down his pen with deliberate care. But that still doesn't explain how Mrs. Cottrell administered the poison. She left the household 3 months ago. How could she possibly have? Because, Whimsy said quietly, Mrs. Cottrell did not leave the household at all. Or rather, she left it in the conventional sense, but she did not abandon her connection to it. The poison would have been administered to the cocoa at some point prior to the nephew's arrival Monday evening. Perhaps it was placed in reserve, prepared and waiting. Perhaps Mrs. Cottrell made one final visit to the vicarage, a visit that occurred sufficiently in advance that no one thought to mention it to your investigating officers. The cocoa, prepared by Miss Pritchard and left in the study, would have already contained its lethal cargo. Whimsy rose and moved toward the door with the air of a man prepared to pursue this investigation to its inevitable conclusion. I suggest, Inspector, that you dispatch men to Hampshire forthwith to locate Mrs. Cottrell. I further suggest that you examine the precise nature of the Reverend's financial arrangements, and whether certain sums had been transferred to individuals in Africa through channels designed to obscure their purpose. And I suggest finally that you prepare yourself for the possibility that the murdered man was guilty not merely of death, but of a betrayal so profound that it drove an ordinarily decent woman to murder. The evening had descended upon Ashford Abbas with that particular completeness that small English villages seem to experience when winter approaches, and the darkness arrived not gradually, but in sudden, decisive waves. Whimsy and Parker had retired to the Crown public house, where the landlord, a nervous individual named Thistleton, who possessed the unfortunate characteristic of sweating profusely whenever addressing persons of authority, had provided them with a private parlor and such refreshments as his kitchen could hastily assemble. It was here, seated before a modest fire and nursing glasses of brandy that had seen better days, that Parker received the telegram from his office in London. His expression, as he read it, underwent that particular transformation that suggested information had arrived of considerable significance, though whether gratifying or troubling remained initially obscure. "The mining company records have been retrieved," Parker announced, setting down the telegram with deliberate care. The nephew, Timothy Hargreaves, was indeed employed by the Kimberley and Eastern Mining Concern. More pertinently, he was listed as admitted to the company infirmary in Johannesburg approximately 20 months ago with a diagnosis of cerebral malaria. His name does not appear on any subsequent departure record, which suggests he either remained in the infirmary for an extended period or was transferred elsewhere for convalescing care. Whimsy set down his glass with the air of a man whose theoretical suppositions were being gratifyingly confirmed by the machinery of institutional bureaucracy. And Mrs. Cottrell? Parker consulted a second telegram that had accompanied the first. The Hampshire Constabulary have located a woman answering her description residing in a cottage near Basingstoke under the name Mrs. Eleanor Finch. She has been ill. The local physician reports she's been confining herself to bed for the past 3 days with a nervous complaint. When the constables informed her of the Reverend's death, she reportedly became quite hysterical and has been refusing to speak coherently since. Whimsy rose and moved toward the window of the parlor, where the darkness beyond had become so complete that the glass served merely as a mirror reflecting the lamplight within. "The question becomes," he observed, his tone taking on that particular quality of philosophical musing that accompanied his most significant deductions, whether Mrs. Cottrell's current nervous collapse is the result of guilt consuming her conscience, or whether it represents something rather more calculated, a performance designed to establish her mental state as insufficiently stable to permit coherent interrogation. Inspector Cranton, who had been summoned to join them, and who sat rigidly in an armchair as though expecting the furniture itself might betray him, ventured a question. Would it be possible for the poison to have been administered in advance? For it to have been placed in the cocoa powder itself weeks ago, waiting only for the proper moment to be discovered and utilized? Whimsy turned from the window with an expression that mingled approval with a certain measured skepticism. Possible, Inspector, but unnecessarily complicated. Cyanide, while stable in proper conditions, is not a substance one merely places in a kitchen cupboard with confidence that it will remain undiscovered. Rather, I suspect. Mrs. Cottrell made one final visit to the vicarage, a visit that occurred shortly before her departure 3 months ago. During this visit, she administered the poison not to the cocoa powder itself, but to something considerably more specific, a particular tin or container that she knew would not be utilized until the precise moment when the nephew's return made its use strategically valuable. Parker was already making rapid notes. But that would require extraordinary prescience. How could Mrs. Cottrell have known the nephew would return Monday? How could she have anticipated the Reverend's emotional state would render him vulnerable to such a scheme? She couldn't have known, Whimsy agreed, which is precisely why the scheme required the participation of another individual who could provide the necessary intelligence. The nephew himself, perhaps, writing to Mrs. Cottrell with information regarding his planned return, or possibly, and this is where the psychology becomes particularly intricate, Mrs. Cottrell had arranged the poisoned container as a sort of insurance policy, a contingency prepared and waiting should opportunity present itself. The parlor door opened at that moment, admitting Bunter with that remarkable prescience that suggested he possessed either genuine telepathy or an exceptionally well-developed ability to read his employer's moods. He bore with him a leather portfolio and an expression that indicated significant information had been acquired through means that remained characteristically unspecified. "I took the liberty, sir," Bunter commenced in his precisely modulated tones, "of making certain inquiries regarding the Reverend's financial arrangements. The bank in town maintains his accounts, and the manager was cooperative upon learning of the circumstances. Over the past 2 years, the Reverend has been making regular transfers of funds to a London solicitor, who has apparently been forwarding them to an address in Johannesburg. The amounts are substantial, approximately £50 per month, consistent with the cost of employing a private nurse for an extended period." Inspector Cranton appeared to be experiencing a moment of profound illumination. The Reverend was paying for the nephew's care. He was providing for his recovery from a distance, but he was deliberately concealing it from the family. "Precisely so," Whimsy confirmed, accepting the portfolio from Bunter and extracting several documents that appeared to be copies of bank records and solicitors' correspondence. The Reverend was, in his way, demonstrating responsibility for his nephew's welfare. However, he was simultaneously engaged in an elaborate deception regarding the nature and extent of the boy's illness. When the nephew recovered and returned to England, he apparently discovered, through Mrs. Cottrell, one suspects, that his uncle had been secretly subsidizing his care while simultaneously telling the family that nothing could be done, that the boy was essentially abandoned to his fate. Parker was now beginning to perceive the full tragic architecture of the crime. Mrs. Cottrell saw this as a betrayal of the highest order. The Reverend had the means to inform the family of the nephew's condition, to bring them comfort and knowledge of his recovery, but instead he kept them in ignorance while secretly paying for his care. It was a betrayal not just of the nephew, but of everyone who loved him. "Indeed," Whimsy agreed, his tone taking on that particular quality of austere judgment that accompanied his most severe moral pronouncements. The Reverend's motives may have been complex, shame perhaps regarding the nephew's illness or fear of scandal, but the effect was to create a situation in which multiple individuals believed themselves abandoned by someone who was in fact laboring on their behalf in secret. And Mrs. Cottrell, who had apparently developed an attachment to the nephew, possibly a romantic attachment, decided that such betrayal warranted the ultimate punishment. He paused, allowing the weight of this conclusion to settle into the consciousness of his listeners. The poison was prepared 3 months ago, placed in a particular container that the Reverend would naturally utilize only when circumstances rendered him emotionally vulnerable. When the nephew arrived Monday evening and presented his accusations, the stage was set. The Reverend, already distressed by the confrontation, partook of the poisoned cocoa, not from any desire to harm himself, but simply because he required comfort in the face of his nephew's fury. Mrs. Cottrell, from her exile in Hampshire, had arranged matters such that her revenge would occur precisely when circumstances made it appear inevitable, a crime not of calculation but of opportunity, the inevitable result of years of accumulated betrayal and concealment. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside the winter night pressed against the windows with all the weight of English darkness. Parker closed his notebook and regarded Whimsy with an expression that mingled professional respect with a certain underlying melancholy. "The nephew," Parker said quietly. "What will happen to young Mr. Hargreaves? Technically, he's guilty of nothing." He didn't know the poison was being administered. Whimsy returned his attention to the fire, his expression suggesting he was contemplating matters of considerably greater complexity than mere legal culpability. "The nephew," he replied, "will spend the remainder of his life wondering whether his letter of accusation served as the instrument of his uncle's death. He will know, intellectually, that Mrs. Cottrell administered poison. But he will never entirely escape the suspicion that his own rage, his own justified accusations, provided the emotional condition that made the murder possible. That, perhaps, is punishment sufficient for a crime he didn't commit but cannot entirely disassociate himself from." The morning that followed brought with it the particular grey luminosity of an English winter dawn, and it was beneath this pallid light that Whimsy and Parker conducted their final interviews. The constabulary had, in the interim, located young Timothy Hargreaves attempting to board a ship bound for Southampton, his modest luggage packed with the apparent intention of fleeing England entirely and vanishing into whatever obscurity the continent might provide. He was brought to the vicarage under police escort, though whether he was technically under arrest remained a matter of considerable legal ambiguity that seemed to perplex Inspector Cranton considerably. Timothy Hargreaves was a young man of approximately 25, with the particular physical appearance of someone only recently recovered from grave illness. His frame retained the narrowness of prolonged confinement, his complexion possessed that pallor that comes from months spent indoors, and his eyes held the peculiar intensity of an individual who has confronted mortality at close quarters and emerged, changed by the experience. When Whimsy and Parker entered the room where he had been confined, they found him standing at the window with his forehead pressed against the glass, as though attempting to merge with the landscape beyond. Parker cleared his throat, a gesture that had the effect of causing Timothy to turn with the startled movements of a man disturbed from profound reverie. "Mr. Hargreaves," Whimsy commenced, settling himself into a chair with the comfortable assurance of someone conducting a drawing-room conver. "Rather than an interrogation, I perceive that you have had considerable time during your travels to consider your position regarding the events of Monday evening. I wonder whether you might enlighten us as to precisely what passed between yourself and your uncle during your visit to this vicarage." Timothy's jaw clenched visibly, and he appeared to be wrestling with some interior conflict of considerable magnitude. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged raw and damaged, as though the words themselves caused physical pain. "I wrote him a letter," Timothy began, his gaze returning to the window as though the graveyard beyond possessed greater interest than the men confronting him. "I didn't intend to write it. I intended to come home and confront him directly, to demand explanations for the years of silence, for the letters that never came, for my family apparently believing me dead or lost beyond recovery. But when I arrived yesterday afternoon and saw him in his study, surrounded by his books and his comfort, I couldn't bear it. I went to my room and I wrote. I wrote about the fever, about the hospital in Johannesburg, about the nurses who believed I would die. I wrote about lying in a narrow bed thinking that my family had abandoned me, that no one cared whether I lived or perished in that God-forsaken place." He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "And then I left the letter on his desk and went to find him. I thought I would explain it all, that perhaps he would explain himself, that there might be some misunderstanding that could be resolved with conversation. But when I found him, he was reading my letter, and his hands were shaking, and tears were streaming down his face. He looked at me as though I had struck him physically. He said, 'God help me.' He said that he had been paying for my care the entire time, that he had spent his own money, considerable amounts, to ensure that I received proper nursing and medical attention. He said he had wanted to tell the family, that he wanted them to know I was being cared for, but that he actually feared, that my mother would attempt to come to Africa, that the journey itself would kill her, that the knowledge of my illness would drive her to despair. Timothy's shoulders had begun to shake, and he appeared to be approaching some form of emotional collapse. I didn't believe him. I thought he was lying, that he was attempting to manipulate me into forgiving him for years of indifference. I accused him of being a coward, of prioritizing his own comfort and reputation over his family's welfare. I told him that he was a hypocrite, that his secret charity was merely an attempt to assuage his own guilt without requiring him to actually face the consequences of his actions. And then he asked Miss Pritchard to prepare cocoa, and he said we would discuss it properly after he had taken some refreshment. He said that perhaps my accusations were just, and that he deserved whatever judgment I might pass upon him. Timothy turned from the window, and his expression had shifted into something more complex than mere grief. There was guilt there, certainly, but beneath it lay something approaching horror. I sat with him while he drank the cocoa. He drank it all quite quickly, as though he were attempting to nerve himself for a difficult conversation. And then, perhaps 10 minutes later, he began to feel unwell. He said his mouth felt numb, that his throat was constricting. I didn't understand what was happening. I thought perhaps he was having some sort of nervous reaction to our conversation, but then he began to vomit, and I could see that something was dreadfully wrong. I ran for Miss Pritchard, but by the time she arrived, he was already unconscious. I wanted to summon a doctor, but Miss Pritchard, she seemed to know somehow that it was too late. She sent for the constable instead of the physician, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether I should remain or flee. I felt as though I had killed him with my accusations, as though my rage had somehow poisoned the very cup he drank from. Parker and Whimsy exchanged glances that communicated without words the fundamental tragedy that had been unfolding. Whimsy rose and approached Timothy with the measured movements of a man dealing with fragile emotional equilibrium. "Mr. Hargreaves," he said quietly, "you did not kill your uncle. Your accusations, however justified, did not administer poison to his cocoa. There was another individual involved in these events, an individual whose loyalty to you had transformed into something far more destructive than mere love. Do you know a woman named Mrs. Eleanor Cottrell?" Timothy's expression underwent a profound transformation. His face went deathly pale, and he appeared to be on the verge of physical collapse. "Mrs. Cottrell," he whispered. She nursed me in Johannesburg. After the initial hospitalization, when I was recovering but still very weak, she was employed as my private nurse. She was—" He broke off, unable apparently to continue. "She was devoted to your recovery," Whimsy completed gently. "And when she returned to England and entered service with your uncle, she became aware of his secret payments regarding your care. She also became aware, through your letters and through her own powers of deduction, that your uncle had kept this support entirely hidden from your family. She saw this as a betrayal not merely of you, but of herself, of the emotional investment she had made in your survival. And when she learned that you were returning to England, she prepared a contingency. That would resolve what she perceived as an intolerable injustice." He paused, allowing the full weight of this revelation to settle upon Timothy's consciousness. Mrs. Cottrell did not intend for the poison to be discovered on Tuesday morning. She intended for it to remain concealed, for the death to appear natural or accidental. It was only the nephew's premature confrontation of the Reverend, and the Reverend's request for cocoa at an unusual hour, that accelerated the timeline and brought about the circumstances that led to his death. Mrs. Cottrell has confessed everything, Mr. Hargreaves. She has admitted that she prepared the poison 3 months ago and administered it to a particular tin of cocoa powder that she knew your uncle preferred for his evening drink. She acted, in her own estimation, out of love for you and out of rage at what she perceived as your uncle's moral cowardice. The confession of Mrs. Eleanor Cottrell came not with dramatic flourish or theatrical revelation, but rather in the austere setting of a Hampshire constabulary office, where she sat in a chair that appeared uncomfortable for purposes beyond mere physical discomfort. She was a woman of approximately 60 years, with features that suggested a life lived in service to others. Her hands bore the particular calluses and discolorations of someone who had worked extensively with cleaning compounds and hot water, and her face possessed that particular configuration of lines that comes from years of disciplined restraint suddenly surrendered to desperation. When Whimsy and Parker arrived to conduct the final interview, they found her sitting with her hands folded precisely in her lap, her expression suggesting a woman who had passed beyond the point of self-defense and had instead achieved a sort of resigned clarity regarding the consequences of her actions. "Mrs. Cottrell," Whimsy commenced, seating himself across from her with the courtesy he extended to all individuals regardless of their legal culpability, "I wonder if you might illuminate for us the precise nature of your relationship with young Mr. Timothy Hargreaves as it existed during your time in Johannesburg." There was a lengthy silence before Mrs. Cottrell responded, and when she finally spoke, her voice emerged with the quality of someone recounting events from a considerable temporal and emotional distance. "I nursed him through the fever," she said simply. "When he was brought to the hospital, the physicians believed he would not survive. He was delirious, you see, calling out for his mother, for his family. No one came. No letters, no telegrams, no indication that anyone in England even knew of his condition. I sat with him through 3 weeks of high fever, and I kept him alive through sheer force of will and professional determination. When he finally began to recover, when the fever broke and consciousness returned, he wept. He wept because he believed his family had abandoned him, that he had been left to die in Africa without any knowledge or concern from anyone who loved him." She paused, and her hands tightened perceptibly in her lap. "I became invested in his recovery, more invested perhaps than was strictly professional. When he was finally well enough to return to England, I felt as though I was abandoning him to a different sort of peril entirely. I secured a position with the Reverend Canon through an agency, thinking that perhaps I might keep some connection to the family, that perhaps I might eventually reveal what I knew about young Timothy's condition and his recovery." Whimsy leaned forward with the intensity of focused attention. "And what did you discover upon entering the Canon's household?" Mrs. Cottrell's expression underwent a transformation into something approaching anguish. "I discovered that the Canon knew everything, that he had been paying for Timothy's care the entire time, that he had ensured the boy received proper medical attention and nursing, and yet he had told no one. His sister, Timothy's mother, believed her son was suffering in ignorance and abandonment in Africa. The family lived under the impression that he had been essentially cast aside to fend for himself in the wilderness. The Canon's charity, his secret provision for Timothy's welfare, was rendered entirely meaningless by his refusal to permit the family to know of it. He kept his good deed hidden while allowing them to suffer in ignorance." She looked directly at Whimsy for the first time, and her eyes held a peculiar intensity. "I asked him about it, you see. After I had been with him for some months, I asked him directly why he did not write to the family, why he did not tell them that Timothy was being cared for. He said—" She broke off, her voice becoming tremulous. "He said that he feared his sister would attempt to travel to Africa despite the danger, that his brother-in-law would demand to take over the financial arrangements and would undoubtedly mishandle them, that the family's knowledge would only create complications and unnecessary suffering. He told me, quite calmly, that his silence was the most merciful course of action, but what he was actually saying was that his comfort, his desire to avoid family complications, was more important than his sister's peace of mind or his brother-in-law's ability to know that his son was alive and recovering." Parker was making careful notes, his expression suggesting he was documenting the psychological rationale behind the crime rather than simply recording facts. "When did you decide to administer the poison?" he inquired quietly. Mrs. Cottrell was silent for a considerable period, and when she finally responded, her voice had become barely audible. 3 months ago, I realized that I could not continue in his service, that my presence in his household was becoming untenable. I also became aware, through certain channels, that Timothy had recovered sufficiently to possibly return to England. I prepared the poison then, not with any definite intention of using it, but as a sort of contingency, a way of asserting that the Canon's betrayal would not go entirely unpunished if circumstance provided opportunity. When I gave notice, I left the poisoned cocoa in the kitchen with the absolute certainty that the canon would eventually use it, and with the equally absolute certainty that I would not be present to witness the result. Whimsy rose and moved toward the window of the constabulary office, where the Hampshire countryside stretched beyond in undisturbed tranquility. "You did not foresee that young Mr. Hargreaves would confront his uncle precisely when the poisoned cocoa was requested," he observed. "That was entirely contingent upon circumstances beyond your planning or control." "No," Mrs. Cottrell agreed. "I thought perhaps the poison would remain in that tin for months, possibly years. I thought perhaps I would eventually learn that the canon had died of natural causes, and I would never know whether my contingency had ever been necessary. But when I learned that Timothy had returned to the village, when I understood that he was confronting his uncle regarding the years of silence, I knew what would happen, and I did nothing to prevent it because I wanted it to happen. I wanted the canon to answer for his betrayal, not merely with his life, but with the knowledge that his own selfishness and cowardice had made that death inevitable." She looked toward Parker with an expression that suggested she was offering him something approaching. "Absolution. I am guilty, Chief Inspector. I am guilty of murder, premeditated murder. I prepared the poison with intention. The fact that I did not know precisely when it would be used does not alter the fundamental nature of my culpability. I accepted the guilt when I prepared it, when I left it in that kitchen, knowing that, eventually, inevitably, the canon would consume it and die. Whether that death came the day after I left his service or a year hence, it was a death I had prepared and made inevitable." The return to Ashford-Abbas occurred on a Friday morning, precisely 1 week after the discovery of Canon Hargreaves's body in his study. The village itself seemed to have settled back into that particular torpor that characterizes small English settlements once the initial scandal has been thoroughly absorbed and discussed at considerable length in every parlor and public house within a radius of 5 miles. Whimsy, having completed his business with the constabulary and satisfied himself that the investigative machinery would proceed toward its inevitable legal conclusion, prepared his departure with the air of a man eager to return to the considerably more manageable problems posed by 15th-century missiles and his wine cellar. It was Timothy Hargreaves who sought him out on the morning of his departure, approaching him at the railway station with the hesitant movements of someone uncertain whether his presence would be welcomed or regarded as an imposition. The young man bore the particular appearance of someone who had aged considerably in the span of 7 days, the fragile recovery from his African illness having been substantially compromised by the emotional catastrophe that had accompanied his return to England. Whimsy, observing his approach, gestured to the station bench with the casual invitation of a man accustomed to the confidential disclosures of troubled individuals. "Mr. Hargreaves," Whimsy commenced, settling himself with the care of someone preparing for a conversation of some duration, "I perceive that you have come to discuss matters that have proven resistant to orderly comprehension during the past week. Pray, proceed with whatever observations or questions you believe require illumination." Timothy lowered himself onto the bench, with the careful movements of someone whose physical reserves remained substantially depleted. "I wanted to thank you," he began, his voice emerging with difficulty, "for permitting me to understand what occurred, for explaining it in a manner that allows me to comprehend my uncle's actions without entirely despising his memory. I came to Ashford-Abbas with such rage, such certainty that he had abandoned me. Now I understand that his abandonment was actually a form of protection, however misguided, however damaging in its ultimate consequences." Whimsy regarded the young man with an expression that mingled sympathy with his characteristic intellectual detachment. "The understanding you have achieved, Mr. Hargreaves, is perhaps the only genuine wisdom to emerge from this entire unfortunate affair. Your uncle was not a malicious man, merely a man who made a catastrophic error in judgment regarding the relationship between secrecy and mercy. He believed that concealment would protect his family from suffering, when in fact it merely inflicted a different form of suffering upon them, the suffering of ignorance, of abandonment, of believing oneself forgotten by someone possessed of the means and resources to prevent such abandonment." He paused, his gaze momentarily fixed upon the railway tracks stretching toward the horizon. "Your mother, I suspect, will derive considerable comfort from the knowledge that your uncle was not indifferent to your fate, that he labored substantially, your behalf. That knowledge cannot undo the years of imagined abandonment, but it may serve as some form of foundation upon which to reconstruct a more nuanced understanding of his character." Timothy was silent for a considerable period, and when he finally spoke, his question emerged with the particular hesitance of someone broaching a matter he suspects may remain unanswerable. "What will happen to Mrs. Cottrell?" Whimsy's expression underwent that subtle transformation that accompanied discussions of legal and moral consequences. "Mrs. Cottrell has been charged with murder, as the law requires. She will stand trial, and the jury will determine her culpability according to the evidence presented and the legal principles that govern such matters. The sentence, should conviction result, will likely involve considerable imprisonment. However, I suspect that the Crown Prosecutor may take into consideration the unusual psychological circumstances that attended her crime, and that the judge may exercise such discretion as the law permits regarding the severity of sentencing." He turned to regard Timothy directly. "The more interesting question, perhaps, is not what will happen to Mrs. Cottrell through the machinery of legal justice, but rather what will happen to her through the operation of her own conscience. She has demonstrated, through her confession and her apparent acceptance of guilt, that she possesses a functional moral sensibility. The years of imprisonment that likely await her will provide considerable opportunity for the contemplation of whether her actions genuinely advanced the cause of justice or merely perpetuated the cycle of betrayal and concealment that your uncle had initiated." Whimsy rose from the bench as the train pulled into the station, emitting that particular hiss of steam that seemed to signal the beginning of departure. "The tragedy of his affair," he observed, "resides not in any individual's malice, but in the accumulated consequences of good intentions rendered catastrophic through the absence of honest communication. Your uncle intended mercy and achieved cruelty. Mrs. Cottrell intended justice and achieved murder. You intended confrontation and achieved an instrument of death. The universe, Mr. Hargreaves, demonstrates a remarkable capacity for converting human intention into precisely those outcomes we most devoutly hoped to avoid." He extended his hand, which Timothy clasped with the gratitude of someone who had been offered not reassurance, but at least the dignity of honest explanation. "Endeavor," Whimsy continued, "to learn from these circumstances the particular value of honest discourse, however painful such honesty might prove. Your uncle's silence, Mrs. Cottrell's concealment, and your own initial assumptions, all constituted failures of communication that generated consequences no individual could have anticipated or controlled. That is perhaps the fundamental lesson this wretched affair has to offer." Whimsy turned toward the train with the practiced movements of someone long accustomed to travel, his luggage being conveyed by Bunter with the efficiency that characterized all his servant's endeavors. As he settled into his compartment, he observed through the window Timothy's solitary figure standing on the platform, the young man's expression, suggesting he was contemplating matters of considerable weight and complexity. The train began to move, gathering momentum as it departed from Ashford-Abbas, and Whimsy permitted himself the luxury of that particular smile, which suggested simultaneous amusement and melancholy in equal measure. Another case resolved. Another community returned to its customary preoccupations. Another murderer delivered to the justice system with all its attendant machinery grinding inexorably forward. Yet what remained, as it always remained, was not satisfaction, but rather the peculiar sorrow that accompanies the revelation of how thoroughly human beings manage to wound one another through the most understandable of motives. He retrieved a volume of classical poetry from his luggage and settled back into his seat, his mind already turning toward the considerably more manageable difficulties posed by medieval manuscripts and the eternal question of how to occupy oneself when not engaged in unraveling the dark complexities of human nature. The Hampshire countryside retreated beyond the window, and Whimsy permitted himself the luxury of forgetting Ashford-Abbas entirely, secure in the knowledge that whatever lessons were to be learned from this affair would be learned not through his intervention, but through the slow, grinding work of time and conscience upon the souls of those who had participated, however reluctantly, in its unfolding.